Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. As the specter of a Trump or MAGA leader returning to the White House looms, how can Canada proactively safeguard its national security amidst potential trade turmoil? What implications would a MAGA-led America have on global alliances like NATO, and specifically Canada's strategic positioning? In today's episode, Kim Nossal dissects the potential ripple effects of a MAGA resurgence, particularly under Donald Trump, touching on the role of trade in Canada's national security concerns, emphasizing the potential fallout of an America First agenda and the personal vendettas that may ensue. MAGA loyalists infiltrating key positions in the American state apparatus could potentially have profound consequences for American democracy and American allies. The consequences are far-reaching, potentially altering the landscape of international relations and reshaping global security alliances. Kim Richard Nossal, distinguished academic and expert in international relations, has left an indelible mark on Canadian academia. Holding a PhD from University of Toronto, Nossal's career spans many decades with key roles in McMaster and Queen's University. This is the Expert Series. Well, Kim, it's an absolute pleasure to have you back on the program. Thank you for joining me. Your new book, Canada Alone, paints a thought-provoking picture. In the midst of a shifting global order marked by an assertive China and a resurgent Russia, the traditional assumption of continued American global leadership seems to be upended. Your book contemplates a scenario where the illiberal, anti-democratic MAGA movement regains power, leading to the fragmentation of the West. In this unfamiliar post-American world, Canadians may find themselves isolated, grappling with the fallout of a revitalized America First policy and a deliberate abandonment of American global leadership. You pose questions in your book that revolve around how Canada should prepare for this potential isolation and navigate the challenges posed by an unpredictable neighbor to the south. This is the backdrop of our discussion as well, and with further ado, Kim, I'll pose my first question to you. If a MAGA leader is elected in the United States in 2024, what would you say are Canada's primary concerns from a national security perspective?
Primary concerns from a national security perspective are absolutely going to focus actually on a sort of a non-security area, and that is trade. Because we know that any MAGA Republican who comes to the White House is going to pursue an America First agenda, which essentially means slapping tariffs on goods coming into the United States. And in the case of if it's Donald Trump, then what we're going to see is an additional problem, very simply because Mr. Trump will come back to office with a desire for revenge against the many leaders who he has how shall we put it, a hate on for. And certainly if Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister in early 2025, then there's no doubt at all that Mr. Trump will take out on Canada his deep-seated annoyance with Mr. Trudeau.
What alternative mechanisms or avenues exist for both countries to sustain mutual security and cooperation, particularly if the relationship at the heads of state level is less than optimal?
I think that the major problem actually is that while the head of governments may not get along, the difficulty is going to be dealing with a changing American state apparatus, a changing American bureaucracy. Because Mr. Trump and the MAGA Republican wing has promised that if they come to power, there's going to be a huge change in the deep state, as they like to call it, which means essentially that there will be many more MAGA loyalists appointed to what today are positions in the American bureaucracy filled with permanent civil servants. Mr. Trump, in the final weeks of his administration in 2020, introduced something called Schedule F. And Schedule F was designed essentially to provide him with the ability to put in place loyalists deep down into the bureaucracy. Now, Schedule F didn't survive 3 days of the Biden administration. Mr. Biden revoked it after 3 days. But Mr. Trump and Mr. Trump's allies have promised that if they return to the White House, Schedule F will be reinvigorated. And once they put in place Schedule F, then quite literally tens of thousands of positions within the American bureaucracy, including the military and the national security agencies of the United States, will be filled with MAGA loyalists. Even today, Mr. Trump's allies, Republicans, are gathering CVs together for people to appoint to these positions. And so what we're going to see is that there's, unlike the past, where Canadians have been reasonably assured that when administrations change and when the president changes, there will be a continuity, essential continuity of the bureaucracy. That is if Schedule F goes into place, that's simply not going to happen. And that's going to change the way in which Canada, and of course all other friends and allies of the United States, can deal with a new administration.
In what way would such an administration impact Canadian foreign policy?
In an indirect way. It's likely that when Mr. Trump, should Mr. Trump come to power, one of the first things that he is likely to do is to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. And we know how this will happen because he's told us. He's told us essentially that he will abandon Ukraine in order to do essentially an agreement with the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin. This, it seems to me, will immediately be followed by something that Mr. Trump has been seeking to do probably for the last 30 or 40 years, and that is to abandon NATO. Mr. Trump has long had the view that NATO is an encumbrance on the United States, that America's various NATO allies are simply free riding, and that if he had his way, the United States would withdraw from NATO. And he's promised, at least in his first term, that in his second term as president, he would make good on that threat to withdraw. Now, people say, well, the United States can't withdraw from NATO unless there is a resolution in the Senate, and the Senate is filled with pro-NATO folks. But the fact is that Mr. Trump can withdraw from NATO without renouncing the Treaty of April of 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty. All he needs to do is to stop appointing American officers to NATO headquarters in Europe, to stop spending American dollars to support NATO, to withdraw American forces from NATO commands. And so what we're likely to see here is the impact on Canada is going to be indirect if, in fact, the United States changes its position on Europe. In the Western Pacific, it's likely also that it's going to have an impact on Canada because America first has real difficulty dealing with friends and allies as friends. And so that in his first administration, Mr. Trump demonstrated clearly that he simply could not manage the relationship with Japan, the relationship with Korea. He had a bit more of an easy time with Australia. But the fact is that Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan are going to be real problems for the United States under an America First MAGA administration. And that, too, is going to have an impact on Canada.
How does Canada strategically position itself for a future where a candidate with political inclinations or policy objectives akin to those of Trump may be elected, even if Trump himself does not secure re-election?
An excellent question, and a question that every single government that is a friend and ally of the United States is asking itself right now. Madame Joly mentioned in that interview in August of this year about Canada's so-called game plan. And the reality is that every government has a game plan for a Trump administration or a MAGA Republican administration. And there isn't a great deal that anyone in the international system can do to actually prepare for either of those two things. There is, of course, the hope that Mr. Biden will be reelected so that the present patterns of American foreign policy are likely to continue. But essentially, I think that most governments will try to do what they did in 2017. They will try to get on with the US administration because most governments have what Mr. Trudeau articulated so well in 2017. He says that the main job of a Canadian Prime Minister is to have good relations with the President of the United States. And every head of government around the world, that is, at least heads of government of friends and allies of the United States, have precisely that. And so that a lot of governments are simply going to try and do what they did in 2017. And in the Canadian case, that essentially meant trying to reach out broadly within the United States in the hope that the Canadian message, which wasn't going to resonate necessarily with Mr. Trump, resonated more broadly.
The United States has experienced presidential assassinations, including some in recent history, Civil War, Great Depression, the profound impact of 9/11. Some may regard the US as an exceptionally resilient nation. Do you see the United States as a political and cultural entity capable of withstanding potential repercussions from a Trump presidency and its attempts to reshape the political system?
I think that it is generally difficult to answer that question, but I do think that there is something behind the argument that the United States as a political community is generally speaking fairly resilient, and that it is capable of dealing with challenges. The real problem here is that the challenges go to the very core of the United States as a liberal democratic state. There's no doubt, in my mind at least, that if in fact Americans vote in a particular way that leads to an America First Republican gaining the White House in 2025, there's going to be a huge challenge to the US as a democratic polity. The so-called Red Caesar movement in the United States is a real thing. There is a real concern about the growth of authoritarianism, about the possibility of future elections in the United States indeed being rigged in a way that they haven't been in the past. There is a certain degree of resiliency built into the American system, the system of checks and balances that lie at the core of the US Constitution. But those checks and balances only work when the various actors act as the founding fathers had anticipated they would act. And here we find a real problem, and that is that so much of the United States Congress on the Republican side is still enthralled to Donald Trump, and indeed fearful of their own voters, that those checks and balances, we didn't see them at all at work between 2017, 2021. The great fear is that they're not going to be in place come 2025.
Transitioning back to Canada, in light of our current standing, perceived by certain entities as perhaps less than reliable, what strategic measures do you believe are imperative for the restoration of Canada's credibility within the global framework? Moreover, how can we proactively position ourselves to exert more influence and bolster our interests in the rapidly shifting global security environment of this early 21st century?
The real problem for Canada is that we have gotten so much in the habit of not taking global politics seriously enough that there's no easy fix. The one way would be for the Canadian government to start spending far more than it does on international affairs more broadly. But that actually becomes exceedingly problematic when the general mood in Ottawa politically is just simply opposes government spending. And so that we see, for example, the defense budget, when at a time when it should be going up, we see pressure on that budget. We also see pressure on the other side of politics, in particular, the Conservative Party of Canada under Pierre Poilievre, pushing the government on its so-called profligate ways. And Mr. Poilievre is attacking the Trudeau Liberals on this issue and not at all coming out in favor of increased government spending on defense. And so we have two political parties at the apex, both committed to trying to remain as stingy and as miserly as Canadians have always been on defense, at least during times of peace. During times of war is different, but during times of peace, Canadians have generally speaking not taken international affairs seriously, not spent on international affairs, and that is going to be something that can't be fixed anytime soon.
Kim, thank you so much once again for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I appreciate your insights and analysis. Hope to have you on again soon, and enjoy the holiday season. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.